morning, Roy. How are you doing today?
Good morning, Simon. Very well. And you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem at all. No problem at all. Thanks for making time. It's a pleasure to kind of bring you on to the series today and just share some of your wisdom about your experience and career to date. So yeah, appreciate that. Cool. So look, the title of today's episode is how do you take a stalling business to the magic markers that set them up for exit? Okay, and I think, look, for people that don't know Roy, obviously the title aligns with part of his career, which I thought was really, really interesting. I've got to know Roy, on a personal level and a career level over the last kind of 6 to 12 months, maybe longer, right? Great level of experience across some awesome businesses. Okay, so really excited to kind of unpack, what we're about to discuss today. So appreciate that. Yeah. But just a little bit of context in terms of the show here. So, welcome. The show today's brought to you by Thornton Gregory. We're a recruitment company. My name's Simon Gregory. I'm one of the directors here. My background's, 10 years working within the MarTech software space. We work with software companies and help them, scale their go-to-market teams across EMEA and North America. So the reason why we're doing these episodes with the likes of Roy is because about 18 months ago, I kind of, it was like reflecting on the 10 years that I spent in the space and recognized that I've met some like absolutely incredible people, like Roy included, right? And heard their stories, they've had profound impact on the space and the companies that they've been involved in terms of growth, in terms of people's careers, and in terms of their discipline and their craft. And I thought it was a real shame, really, that actually we weren't creating a platform that can help others and give back to the community in that respect. So, I started to spin up some of these episodes, sort of asking favors, really, of the people that I've met, like Roy, and spending a little bit more time with us and bringing to life different topics. So if you go to the body of content on YouTube or Spotify, you'll see stuff around go-to-market leadership. You'll see more like regional stuff, like around like bringing companies into the DAC, for example, sales enablement, RevOps, customer success, and pre-sales, right? Stuff that, is evolving as a catalyst of technology and just stuff that I just thought would be really, really interesting from SMEs within what they do. So, look, that's a little bit of a kind of intro and spiel, but, Roy has had some awesome experience across Experian marketing services and all the other kind of incarnations of the name and the brand that they had over the period you were there, and Bizarre Voice and Shoutlet, one of the pioneers in the kind of social space. And also, the reason for the title is his involvement with a business called Selligent, where Roy, was instrumental in getting them to these magic markers, as we put in the title, and unlocking private equity investment and ultimately an exit over the 6 and a bit years that you were there. So, Roy, I've given you a little bit of, sorry to steal your thunder a little bit there, but I've given you a little bit of an intro. But for the people that don't know you, or the first time they come across you, can you tell them a little bit about your background and career today, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not entirely sure how I follow up your opening gambit, Simon, but I'll certainly do my best. But yeah, look, firstly, I came into SaaS June 2005. But prior to that, I'd spent 4 years working across the agency landscape. So I had the privilege of working, across some of the big agency networks, the WPPs, the Omnicoms of this world. And that was predominantly across, new business, establishing, sort of how we go out and seek new accounts. But my journey from the agency networks transitioned into SaaS, really based on some of the sort of headwinds and tailwinds that we were seeing. So, you had the demise of things like direct marketing or direct communications, as we used to refer to it, because of the advent of e-commerce, which took us into things like email. So I'm in terms of, I think, landing into SaaS, whilst I didn't necessarily understand technology, what I understood was the narrative of those key personas, the CIOs, the CMOs of this world, et cetera, et cetera. So since June 2005, I've had the privilege, as you've mentioned, of being part of 3 exits, 2 trade acquisitions, 1 IPO, for most of that time, I've predominantly been across Martech, which has been at the forefront of anything that we recognise as customer experience, if you like. But more recently, I've spent the last 3 years in employee experience, senior sales leadership roles for the last sort of 15, 16 years. And again, I think, some of the questions, or one of the questions I'm often asked is, what type of senior sales leader am I? And for me, I think predominantly, if I think about that ARR range, then, I've landed, I think, comfortably in that sort of range of between sort of 10 million to 100 million. And we'll talk about those magic markers or horizons of growth. But I've had a fantastic time, not had a job in sort of 16, 17 years, if you like, Simon. They've all been incredibly insightful and valuable journeys.
Brilliant. And you talked a little bit about some of the the moments in your career there that stand out. But have you got any sort of real key milestones? And if so, can you talk to those?
Yeah, oh my goodness.
Big question.
Yeah, exactly. I think there've been plenty, right? And I think, it's I think what's really important is, how do you get your head above the parapet and actually understand what you've achieved, or, I think, what you've been doing over the last however many years. But actually, if I think back to, I think, key milestones, I think there is no doubt that Cheetah Mail was probably the first real marker for me. I joined that business as an individual contributor. I came out of the gates pretty quickly, I guess, and I think that's more to do with my agency background, sort of understanding the narrative around how you articulate technology as an enabler. But I was asked to then lead the European sales organisation, but I was put into that role as a player manager. So that was a major milestone for me. Suddenly you're in the chair. Your responsibility and remit has changed significantly, but you're also working, managing and leading with people that you've sold with. Now, for me, that was an incredible breeding, genuinely, it really was. And I think, if ever that opportunity arises, I'd encourage anyone to sort of sit in that player manager seat and then sort of move through the ranks. So that was certainly a marker for me. And then again, I think, when I think back to the formative journeys, Selligent, that was an M&A. I was part of a North American organisation. Selligent was acquired by HGGC, which was a mid-market private equity organisation out of Palo Alto, San Fran, and they crashed us together. Now, that was my first real gig, if you like, under the stewardship of a private equity organisation. Completely different ballgame. The level of detail, the brutality of all the perceived brutality, in the boardroom, knowing every facet of your business. So those are, I think, what I would probably refer back to as key milestones for me.
Obviously sat in the recruitment seat, I speak to people that have been under private equity and VC, right? What's it like in a PE environment? If you what's it like on the front line there?
Yeah, it's tough. I think with anything, why a PE company, or in fact, look, when you take any investment, right? I think firstly, out of the gates, you want to understand that it's a partnership and not necessarily a left boot. And certainly under the stewardship of HGGC, it wasn't a left boot; it was a partnership, very much so. But again, it's all about the detail. Again, you have to understand your numbers. There has to be rigor and robustness in your sales process. There has to be well-established operating rhythm, because ultimately you need to become a data-driven organisation where you're feeding the right forecasts and accuracy up the line. So,
was that quite a quick learning experience for somebody like yourself, Roy, in that first boardroom meeting?
It was, absolutely, absolutely, because there isn't room for for fluff and sort of meandering clumsily. You have to paint the next 3 months through numbers. And if you cannot do that, the questions come hard and fast, and they're difficult.
I can imagine.
I come back to that. In fact, there was. I remember. I think I took over global revenues in the summer 2017, and for a large part, we had I think good discipline in terms of sort of understanding that revenue engine, right? So MQLs through to revenue converted or dollars converted. but we just couldn't show contingency in terms of how we were going to hit the next quarter's growth. And that was, that was a real learning curve.
Yeah. That's cool. So look, when I look at the background, you touched upon it there. There's two major blocks. There's the Selligent stuff that we talked about, and there's the Experian. I think both of which are nearly 7 years, respectively.
Sure.
Clearly fascinating journeys, different stages, brand names. In fact, like share a little bit more about those learnings and lessons from those two particular stages of your career.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start with, Experian. And again, I think, to all intents and purposes, we refer to it as Experian Marketing Services Group, but again, we were very much operating under that brand of Cheetahmail, right? North American parent, out of New York, going, absolutely, I think, flying in the US. And we were enjoying that halo effect, right, from North America, because they were acquiring some huge global brands. And you'd expect to see that from a well-oiled SaaS organization. But our challenge when I came in, or when I took over the player manager role at Cheetahmail, was that most of the opportunities we were walking into, we were cold.
Okay.
We were genuinely cold. So, that, and I guess at that time as well, there was a perceived arrogance with Cheetahmail, with Cheetahmail, and that was purely, I guess, predicated by the fact that North Americans were absolutely killing it. So the output from that was, I think, our first couple of big RFPs, we perhaps were in that, we're at the table expecting to win, and we didn't. But we had a phenomenal leader at Cheetahmail called Steve Lomax. Was certainly doubled as my mentor. But I think what he really taught that leadership team was detail.
Cool.
And I mean, at every single turn, we left no stone unturned. To the point, and I think this is where it shifted for us. An RFP came in, and we know how, I think, onerous this exercise can be, right? And you've got 101 questions, and do you answer yes? Do you answer no? And Stephen never allowed us to do that. If we answered yes, we had to give context and colour. And that was our first major shift in terms of, I think, delivering our very best written response. And actually, over the course of maybe, I think, the next 3 to 6 months, adopting a very detailed approach, we started to get that feedback, even at that early stage. Clients, and Emirates was a good example. I think some of the feedback that came to us post exercise was really, really impressed with the level of your written response, and that was the shift for us. And so we'd come out of that exercise, we understood the competition very well. We were very, very clear on our commercials. We were very, very clear on our points of differentiation. And then the next level of detail was then gearing up for the pitch. And I promise you, I think some of the presentations that we put together, with the help of people like Andy Bounds, who came in to help us, because we knew that's what needed to be addressed. How did we walk into the room on that particular day and get that room jumping? And that was something we'd done incredibly well over the next sort of 12 to 24 months. We never came off that detailed track. But yeah, a really, really big learning at Cheetahmail. And, that's a business we grew from, I guess, 3 million to 40 million in about 3.5, 4 years. Acquired some amazing logos, along the way. And then I think the same question was
Selligent. Sounds like great fun, by the way. That growth and learning and challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was the advent of ESPs, right? And there were some, I think it was Epsilon and Silverpop, and I was
going to ask who the incumbents were. Like, who were the big incumbents in those like Emirates-esque deals?
Yeah, so it was, from memory, I think it was Epsilon and I can't the organisation out of France. I can't remember what they were called now. You're taking me back. You can take me back.
No worries. Was Silverpop an independent company, or was it with IBM?
Silverpop was still privately owned at that time.
Yeah, okay.
But again, if I think about going into some of those opportunities, we knew we'd be going up against Silverpop. eDialogue was the other one.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And so forth. But Silverpop, for example, they'd been in there as you would on a classic enterprise sales process, months before we'd had the opportunity to engage. But yeah, great times, great teams. I think we lost one person in 4 years.
Oh, cool.
Managed a few people out along the way. But yeah, great team.
Yeah, yeah, and so you're saying similar kind of like threads there with the Selligent stuff, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think certainly when when you become that detail oriented, it doesn't leave you, right. You
Yeah,
understand
cool.
the outcomes of you know leaving no stone unturned, thinking hard about your sales process. But again, I think when I think about these things, and we may touch on this later again, so I don't want to be sort of overly repetitious, but um, it's about understanding how you create a process that everyone's accountable to, and how they own that process, and not the other way around.
Yeah,
And at Selligent, it was very similar. I think that the difference at Selligent was that you had a much broader mandate because we were across Southern Europe and Northern Europe. You had a bunch of different cultures that you had to bring together to get something that was cohesive and consistent in your selling style, if you like. But again, when you take all of those things, Selligent, I think the early days of Selligent was more around how we built that operating rhythm and
yeah,
everyone accountable and bought into that process.
yeah, yeah. Cool. Like with a high performing background, like you were showing when you came to market, I'm sure you probably had some options, right, in terms of roles that were presented. Um, how did you assess those new roles and those opportunities?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it took me a while to sort of work out what I was looking for. I've been very, very fortunate, in the last sort of 15, 16 years. I'd sort of been taken around or had the privilege of leading certain organisations because of the network or previous leaders that I'd worked with. But for me, I think it boils down to to four things, because this is what I love to do. Right, I love that growth. At a regional level, it's really important for me to have that growth journey ahead of me. It's what I like to do. I like to move at sort of 200 miles an hour. And for me, I think my guiding principles, if you like. I think one, it's working with with a relevant value proposition that's standing up in today's marketplace and sits comfortably with me. Right, it has to be something that I embrace, something that I enjoy. The second piece is probably understanding that organisation has a forward-looking product roadmap or strategy that's moving at the same pace. If it's not, there's a danger that you're in the marketplace being accused of selling smoke and mirrors. Now, don't
Yeah,
get me wrong, I think there's always an element of smoke and mirrors with any good SaaS organisation that has a well-oiled sales and marketing function, if you like. The third piece, and this is obviously again predicated by nascency of whatever space or segment you're in, is validation by the analyst community, whether that's a Gartner or the Forrester or the Forresters of this world. And then the fourth piece is depth and breadth of the leadership team. And for me, that's just, that's I think more of a personal, guiding principle. I played a lot of football when I was younger, so that team dynamic is massively important for me, knowing that I'm jumping into bed with like-minded individuals. So those are the four things
yeah,
that I tend to look for when leaning into something new, Simon.
yeah. I think speaking to people like yourself, it's important to have those guardrails. I think because with there being 12,000 vendors
Yeah,
in the software space, it's easy to be kind of attracted by the next shiny thing, right? But crunching that kind of really hard criteria, which makes sense, each
yes.
on an individual level, I think probably has done you well. Um, okay, look, off air, me and you, we talked at length about EQ, yeah, and why that is important for leadership. I think that's feels like a really important thing for you personally.
Yeah.
Can you just expand on that a little bit more to our listeners, please?
Yeah, yeah. I'll try. I think it's a really I think tough topic to try and unpack at times. But look, I always go back to I think some of my own personal experiences, right, that were through childhood or adolescence, and at times, So firstly, I think it's about authenticity, right? We think about the broad topic of emotional intelligence, and that's knowing your own story, owning your own story, right? Um, and not all stories are plain sailing. There are challenges. There are sort of mishaps along the way. And if I think back to my time playing football, maybe I was quite an insecure teenager, if you like. but I played under a guy that played football before, but he was the guy that sort of used to grab hold of me by the scruff of the neck and say, if you don't play today, this team does not tick. But ultimately, what he'd done was he'd understood what I needed to be motivated or be inspired, and he used to make me feel 12 foot tall. And so for me, that that EQ, that emotional intelligence, is a really, really important thing. And I followed him. We all followed him. So when I try and dial that back, Simon, it is about authenticity. Like I said, it's about owning your story, and I think that's the cornerstone of EQ, right? And then you think about, well, what comes next? And if you're leading that team and you have that authenticity, you have to be reliable, okay? And reliability is what then builds trust. So if you've got authenticity as the cornerstone of emotional intelligence, if you like, then reliability becomes that structure. And then again, as that cascades down, then it's about communication. It's about validating feelings, I guess, not just ideas. Being empathetic to to the teams that you're working with. So, for me, it's a hugely important thing, and it's what defines leadership in my mind. Right, leadership and management, as we know, are two entirely different things, and the weighting of those will differ based on size and shape of organisation, stage of growth, etc., etc. But for me, if you don't have that EQ, you don't know or you don't understand how much process, how much structure, what type of methodology to implement at a certain stage of growth. And for me, that's the art as you move through those, magic markers, whether that's 10 million, 30 million, 50 million, 75 million, and then north of. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, no, absolutely does. Yeah. So you mentioned there just about the variety of environments you've joined, right? So change management is a very, very difficult thing to get right.
Sure.
But you've had to, I guess, for what it sounds like, sort of pioneer some of that change management and be like the figurehead that's doing a lot of that stuff, which I'm sure isn't an easy thing to do at scale, or you can't please everybody. But what is your viewpoint on how to do that correctly?
Yes, great question. And again, listen, I think we've just touched on some of that, right?
Yeah.
Much of that is, having that emotional intelligence to, to understand what's good, what's bad, what's indifferent, what's emotional, right, Simon? But Selligent's a good example of that. I was working with a North American component called Strongmail. HGGC acquired Selligent, which was born in Belgium. I think it'd been trading best part of 15, 16 years, good revenue footprint across Southern Europe. And we were crashed together. There was every chance, I guess, I could have been walked out of the organisation at that point. But I met with the Selligent CEO, Andre Lejeune. We talked about his philosophy for growth. I think we tried to understand each other's cultures, each other's approach to growing businesses, dealing with people, because to all intents and purposes, I was picking up somebody else's baby, if you like. So we talk about the emotional intelligence. That's that's front and center in terms of how you set about that. And again, it's that cornerstone of authenticity. It's communication. I think if you think about the first 90, 120 days, you have to be visible. I think it's really important to really get under the skin of the business, understand the cultural nuances, and just to bring that to life. I hadn't realised, for example, that if you think about that Belgian culture, how well tenured the people are there. Most of the kids have been there. Most of the people have been there 10, 15 years, and typically had started their careers within engineering or development or product or whatever, and slowly sort of come forward into client-facing roles, and that makes them incredibly valuable. Maybe less so than what you see within the UK market. But again, I think visibility, communication, and doing that with frequency was absolutely key. I think setting the tone for what we should all expect, but equally, I think giving everyone the opportunity to to own that, be accountable to that as we moved forward. And I have to be honest. It felt like, I think, one of the quickest change management programs that I've been part of. That said, We had incredible talent right across that organisation. It wasn't necessarily a business that was in dire straits. It was single digit growth, and we just needed to accelerate that slightly. So we had good talent in that business. We had a fairly, I think, mature outlook, if you like, in terms of the types of profiles that were in seats. So there wasn't too much of a problem, if you like, in terms of the people that we had on the bus. But what we did need to do is finesse some of that operating rhythm, and move forward from there. But everyone played a part in how we then shifted our plan, shifted our operating rhythm, and everyone was bought in. And the combination of that was that we then led into QBRs, which the organisation had not done before. Everyone being accountable, understanding their metrics, understanding, contingency and pipe, shooting towards the same goals, all working with the same dashboards. Really, really important. And the QBRs were, the first one was a car crash. Second, third, fourth were amazing. And by that time, we'd have product in, we'd have marketing in, we'd have finance in. It was brilliant.
Must be really rewarding to think back on said car crash, right? And then obviously the learning and the iterating and the getting that car back on the road,
And just before we move on there, Simon, and actually what was really interesting, that fear that fear leading up into that first QBR, because we're on stage, we're going to articulate ultimately where we are against plan, what our forward-looking projection is across the next quarter, and then we're going to get heavy into detail on your top 3 deals, and that's in front of it's in front of your peers, which is quite a daunting thing. As the QBRs grew, you'd have product there, you'd have marketing there that all wanted to chime in, but this was something that genuinely they own. So it was all about empowerment, ultimately. And like I said, I think come the second QBR, the organisation looked entirely different.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. You touched upon. I don't know so much about the sort of the Belgium tech scene or even hiring culture, if you will. But I personally find over the 10 years I've been doing this, the cross-border sort of cross-cultural, diversity, if you will, really, really interesting. And I love speaking to different nationalities and all that kind of good stuff. But I know it holds challenges, of course, making sure that everybody is on, as you say, on the bus, on board, North Stars there, right? How did you, what were the challenges and opportunities with that in mind, across EMEA and global teams from your experience?
Yeah, so I'd say the biggest challenge there. So I think firstly, again, when we come in and we talk about that visibility, that first 90, 120 days, I think my ask of the organisation was for, I think for everyone to take their own personal brand seriously. Okay.
Yeah.
And I mean that very, very deliberately. If you have a sales guy or a client success person or whatever it happens to be that takes their own personal brand seriously and is thinking about just deploying good manners on a daily basis, and what I mean by that is, how you treat your peers with respect, how you prepare well for your first client interaction or whatever it happens to be, then you are 30% of the way there. Okay, because what you have inevitably are good behaviours running through that organisation. So that was always the immediate cornerstone of everything that we talked about. Okay, take your own personal brand seriously. Okay, after that, then you start to turn the heat up a little bit. It's inevitable, right? Okay, you start to drill into the numbers a bit harder. The cadence around sales management starts to increase. But again, I think if you've set the tone for the operating rhythm and the dashboards that we're all consistently working to, then that shouldn't be too much of a challenge. But I think one of the things perhaps that I struggled with. So if you go from country to country, what a VP of digital in the UK may not be exactly the same thing in Belgium, for example. And what you also have is that fear of, let's say, a Roy coming into a sales process. And I think that was probably the biggest challenge across, let's say, areas of Southern Europe. Probably less so in the UK because that's where I was sat. Built the team ground up. So it was, it was a very natural thing straight out of the gates. But yeah, that was probably the biggest challenge. I think, trying to insert myself into the sales process, but convincing the teams that for me it was all about just letting them continue to drive the sale, and I think there was a bit of resistance to begin with, and then I remember working with a guy called Dennis. We worked together across Bowl.com, huge deal for Belgium, and we went into that together. It took a bit of while. It took some time before we knew it. We were out of the sales process into pole position in front of procurement, and it was all about letting Dennis, run that opportunity. He was capable, but again, trust. Right, we talk about the reliability factor. So those were the challenges, but quickly overcome. I think once you get those that first couple under your belt.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. If I go back to the kind of the title of the kind of episode today, we talk a little bit about the magic markers. But look, the current climate, like I really hope and I feel actually is turning a little bit in terms of hiring and SaaS in general. But it's been challenging, right? And a lot of companies or leaders of companies that may be listening to this have seen pretty flat growth in terms of the last 18, 24 months, maybe even a bit longer. What are the kind of magic markers that you refer to?
Yeah, and I may have touched on this earlier, Simon. And again, I think for me, I think we all know how difficult it is for organisations to get to 1 million, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a super hard challenge. But for them, certainly in my experience, if I think about those, those next magic markers, it's that 10 million gate, 30 million, 50 million, 75 million, and then you're sort of hurtling towards exit territory, if that's the chosen the chosen outcome. And again, I think without being without repeating myself, I think the art is knowing, as you're scaling through those markers, how much process, how much structure, what is the methodology, and ensuring that you're tuned, as you go through those chapters, if you like, and I think, whether we like this or not, right? A CEO that takes you to 5 million or to 10 million is not necessarily going to be the same CEO that takes you to an event. And the same rule applies to all of us, to myself, to, other individuals that you have in the organisation.
Is there a gate there that you found more challenging than another? I mean, the 0 to 1 stuff is very difficult. I agree with you there, but
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. I think 30 to 50 can be, can be a bit tricky. I think.
Why is that?
Yeah, I think that puts you between, again, typically when I've been in that particular revenue range, for me, it's when you then maybe start to pivot out of mid-market into upper mid-market and lower enterprise, which that realises a slightly different type of selling animal, if you like, or someone that has slightly different skills as it relates to client success and understanding customer journeys and how that then translates into GRR, etc., etc. So that's been, I think that's probably where in my earlier career that I had to think much harder about the decisions we took, about how we essentially how we execute against the go-to-market plan and so forth. But yes.
Yeah. So it's an organizational personnel kind of thing that, I mean, if I draw upon a little bit of my experience, I've never sat in a software company clearly, but, that 0 to 1 is very difficult. I think, what I see companies fail or create more problems for themselves is hiring for the stage they're at and not the stage they want to be at, potentially.
Correct. Yep.
And we do a lot of counsel with our clients around that you need to get people that have either seen the stage that you're at or seen the next stage, because it has unique challenges. And if you're seeing it for the first time, it can be very jarring to somebody's, ability to succeed. Yes. Work-life balance, maybe not there. Just general kind of working pattern, not being able to spread themselves across the same business. I see it really highlighted in on a consistent basis when I see that maybe 30 to 50 is a good example, but when they're pulling people from an
Corporate.
Adobe or a Salesforce
Yep.
or an Oracle, who maybe in their, maybe in their earlier career have done a little bit of startup, but are coming from that environment and they're like dropped into what is still a kind of a scale up,
Yep.
scale up, which might not have all of the brand representation and value engineering capabilities and all these kind of, quarterback-esque sales styles. I mean, do you agree? Have you seen the similar? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, listen, absolutely. I think that hiring is so. In short, yes, I do agree.
Yeah.
I think we've just touched on that piece. Albeit quite lightly. What gets you to 10 million doesn't get you to 75 million, and it requires a different size and shape of profile. I've had some wonderful teams across the years. Like genuinely, I really have. But I always thought long and hard about the type of profiles that we brought into the business. And look, I think that the revenue range that historically I've sat in is just a very natural thing for me. So I don't want to sort of I don't want to try and over prescribe it, but I think so put it this way, I've always found incredible richness in talent when fishing from the likes of an Adobe, a Salesforce, an Oracle, an IBM, whatever it happens to be. But you find those personnel that have landed there, may have spent 2-3 years there, they understand process, structure, methodology, but they are there courtesy of an acquisition. Okay.
Yeah.
But to bring that to life, one of the reasons I came back into Selligent, or I came back into that domain, was because I felt there was enough fluidity in the market for one more acquisition. Okay. Exact Target had gone to Salesforce, Silverpop had gone to IBM, Responses had gone to Oracle, Neolane had gone to Adobe. So suddenly, and these things are cyclical, right? There's a big acquisition every 4 or 5 years. SaaS history will tell you that. So, yeah, listen, I absolutely concur, and finding those right profiles and bringing the right people onto the bus is massively important.
Yeah. No, cool. What are the foundational things that you feel are business critical to reignite growth towards those markers that you mentioned, those revenue gates?
Yeah, again, look, it's in the planning, right? It's in that go to market planning, and again, I'm not sure. And again, depending on size and shape of organisation, on stage of growth, I think it's really important that you go back to things like ICP, right?
Yeah.
Customer profile, and then start to, I think, apply the right criteria that gets you to a place where you are genuinely hunting in the right places. Now, this is all really obvious, and we do this time and time again. The only, if I go back to Selligent UK, we didn't really have a revenue footprint in the UK because the business had gone Belgium, Munich, or Belgium, France, Munich, then North America. Okay. But the size of the opportunity in the UK was huge, given some of that consolidation I talked about just a couple of moments ago. So when I think about that, think about ICP and all of the associated activities with go to market. What we had to do was have that triage of marketing, business development, and the ICs own that plan. Okay, so we all built that plan together. This wasn't Roy's plan. Okay, this wasn't a global plan per se. It wasn't Andre's plan. So we built this plan together, really understanding that how could we lean in and execute without wasting too much time in our funnel, because that's what we could not afford to do. So we were incredibly prescriptive about the type of opportunities we went after. And I'll bring this to life very, very quickly for you. Okay, we knew that consolidation had taken place in the market. Exact Target had gone to Salesforce, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
What we wanted to identify were brands that had a history of backing disruptive technology.
Yeah.
And we knew we would find that in that upper mid-market segment, which would typically be organisations with global turnover of anywhere between, let's say, $600 million and $1.2 billion. And that is the segment we fished in. And on very, very few occasions did we find ourselves, in a process where we get right to the end and they said, we love what you have to say, we love your disruption, we love your agility, but we're an Oracle shop.
Yeah.
And that's what we avoided. So it was about being incredibly prescriptive in our execution, in our planning, and then executing with, with a real laser focus. Everything that underlined what we done, we thought about seasonality. So, for example, why are we targeting retail? Why are we talking to retail organisations coming out of the summer when we know the key selling period for travel was January, February, March? Okay, how did we understand how fiscal calendars and how people plan their and how organisations plan their budgets? How did that feed into how we were executing, or how we were campaigning, or how we were outbounding? So all of those things were hugely important.
And that, you reckon, was just like one step or a couple of steps ahead of how the other vendors in the space were thinking? Did that serve you well?
I would like to think so. I think more so than that, I would suggest that the people we brought into the business is what put distance between us and the competition.
Yeah. Okay. That night leads nicely into the next question. So you touched upon a bit about how you agonized and got really granular on the type of person that you hired, right?
Yes.
Let's dig into that a bit more. So there's gates, and there's certain personnel that get you to those gates, right? But what does the right person look like in your eyes? Are there like personality traits or hard skills that you kind of really look to kind of hire for?
Yeah, good question. And again, look, I think a lot of this comes down to to the traits of your hiring manager, if you like. For me, certainly when I was interviewing, I want to be able to bring profiles into the organisation or have a first sitting with them where I'm having a conversation with an adult, because what I'm really, really interested in more than anything is how does this person present himself in a C-suite environment. That's what I'm really, really keen to understand. And so I just said a couple of exercises. First, I think the first session would be, just a 15, 20-minute conversation, just trying to, understand the person that sat in front of me. If I can, some of their upbringing, what motivates them, what they like, what they dislike. But it would be, I think it'd be, for me, those profiles, or I think trying to identify the right profiles would be much more of an emotional thing than it would be around, let's say, your sales track record. That would be your stage 2. And coming into stage 2, it would be less about your sales. I mean, of course, it would be about your sales track record. Hopefully, you'd know there was a bit of a known quantity, because it was quite a small space, right, Simon? But more importantly, I'd want them to articulate their numbers, their commission. And I think if you could do that, and you could do that well, then for me that suggested that there was real authenticity in that profile.
Yeah. No, that's good. I mean,
you'd be amazed at how many candidates can't.
Yeah. No. It's refreshing that you want to get to know the person behind the CV. I mean, obviously, I think what you described there makes sense, because I think the CV triggers the conversation in the first place. So if they don't have the kind of recognized logo or somewhat decent metrics on the CV, you wouldn't take the call in the first place. But these startups, I mean, even at the companies and the size you're talking about, you're spending a lot of time with these people. You've got to get on with them, right? And you've got to rely on them when the heat gets turned up, right? So I think that's interesting. So look, the preparation piece is something that you mentioned. You talked about ICP and all that kind of good stuff, right? But where do you see companies fall down in terms of how they prepare to go to market?
Where do I see companies being called out?
Yeah, sorry, fall down, or where do you see companies sort of fall short? Is probably a better way around preparation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a I think that's a difficult one to answer, because I like to think in most of the journeys that I've been involved in, that we haven't. That said, let me try and flip that question. Okay.
Sure.
There've been many occasions, right, in and around enterprise selling and where there's a fairly thorough process, right, to understand the lie of the land. Okay. Where I would say other companies fall short, in spite of having rigor in their sales process or a methodology around enterprise selling, is where that leadership and management is perhaps still not there. And what you have is an organization that are owning a process, or sorry, being owned by a process and not owning the process.
Okay.
Outcome for me, when you have an organization that is owning the process, is that you very, very quickly deploy trusted advisors into the middle of organizations that can then walk the corridors of whomever. When the process owns you, it's very difficult to become a trusted advisor because you're lacking that authenticity, you're lacking that emotional intelligence. Does that make sense, Simon?
So are you saying there like people are, so you're like imposing a robotic process on these people, right? And that doesn't get, yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, and you're not getting the best, most authentic. I guess that kind of bleeds into like, buyers see that, right? If they're being asked questions off a sheet as opposed to somebody, like to your point, like somebody really trying to get to know the person that's buying the software, right? I think that's probably true to say as well. I mean, with all the AI and automation in the world at the moment,
Sure.
people still buy from people.
Look,
right?
and I think that's come round. In my mind, that's come round. I've had the good fortune, look, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, right? Last 3 years I spent in and around employee experience.
Yeah, sorry.
And my goodness, what a natural transition moving from CX to EX. Because
Yeah.
the market's asking, how do we treat employees like customers, right? So they're now just on the transformation that I've lived through. And I've met with, I think, something like over 130 CIOs in the last 18 months that are starting to get to grips with, how do I work with a CHRO? It's a coming together of two personas that hasn't really happened before. Okay.
Yeah.
But if you take the average board has 9 positions, right? Whether it's CIO, CMO, CPO, etc., etc. How do you understand their direct reports? How do you understand the KPIs and goals of each of those people that sit under those 9 personas? You need to understand that landscape. Maybe not all of them at any given time, but your ability to demonstrate, let's say, to a CIO that you understand how to navigate his organisation gives incredible confidence.
Yes.
And I still think it's an area that we fall frightfully short on.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Look, next question is a hopefully, well, it's a very big question. You could probably run a whole episode on it, but it's around enterprise selling, right, as a craft.
Yeah.
High level, please. Like, how have you seen that evolve in your career, like as a thing?
Yeah, I think. It's interesting, and I think I may have just answered it inadvertently. I think that certainly, we've worked with Miller Heiman over the years. We've worked with Spin, Challenge, Medic, Medpic, and so forth. Okay, for me, look, we can be as prescriptive as we like, right? We've got to understand who the technical buyers are, who the user community is, who's your coach, who's your champion, who's the economic buyer, what are the business KPIs, and that's a really complex thing to do, right? As you're navigating enterprise sale. I think that the evolution of strategic selling has come back twofold to actually where the focus is much more on actually how you deploy a trusted advisor and what are the associated skills to become a trusted advisor within an organization and then walk the corridors across a period of sort of 9, 12 to 18 months. So I think it's come back. I think there's been a bit of a reverse cycle in terms of, people buying people, especially in a climate that is full of uncertainty, right? They need that trusted advisor. The climate's been in a tough place, as I've said, for the last 3 years. The recessionary traits are evident. So I think our ability to genuinely sit in the shoes of whatever persona and talking their language is huge. And for me, that borders a lot in terms of emotional intelligence. And I'll say on that, we talk about business KPIs. But one of the single biggest question, or one of the toughest questions to be able to answer, Simon, when you're in that strategic landscape or that enterprise landscape, is also understanding the personal KPIs for a particular individual. And you cannot do that if you are being owned by a process or simply do not have the nous to engage in a conversation and bottom that out.
Yeah, fascinating. I always ask each guest, just the last question today is like, how do you personally see 2025 play out from a sort of, space perspective, or any predictions or views you have on that?
Yeah, tough one. And I'm not sure I'm sort of best qualified to answer that. But look, I've just talked about recessionary traits. I still see them being around for a while, certainly for the next couple of quarters. I think it's, I do think it's a tight market. There's lots of economic pressure there. We're seeing deal cycles elongate, and we've seen that behaviour over the last 18, 24 months. That said, again, I talked about 4 or 5 year cycles here, and yet I see some really interesting things happening out there, whether that's a Zeta or someone like a Voyado in both organisations in Martech. And then I think about, again, the domain of things like sustainability or DE&I or employee experience, incredibly buoyant segments where we've seen some big multiples in the last 3 years. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom at all, but certainly for the next couple of quarters, I do think it's quite tight.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Look, I know you had a great kind of exit with this previous business that you're with, and you went off to do a bit of kite surfing with your son and had some nice time off. But look, for anybody that's kind of got this far, what are we now, 51 minutes in, and had a good back and forth there about the topic, how can people get in touch with you? What's the best way to do that?
I'm on LinkedIn. I think that's probably the easiest way to get in touch with me. I'll probably resist giving you my mobile number or my email address just yet.
Yeah, that's fine. Oh, yeah, that's fine. I won't tag it in the copy of the post. Don't worry. Okay, cool. Look, it's been really, really good. I think we covered some great ground there. It's really interesting to get under the hood of how you think about these things. I mean, you very humbly kind of mentioned that IPO, couple of trade sales, I think, and an exit. So anybody that's listening to this, Roy does really know what he's talking about. That isn't a fluke. So that was awesome. Look, as always, we've got a little bit of fun just to finish off. Okay. So quick fire questions. We talked to a lot of business there. So this is just really trying to understand a little bit about who Roy is, more so than anything, right? So first thing that comes into your mind, please. No big pauses. Favorite piece of tech or app you are using now?
Too Good to Go.
What's that?
So it's an app that counters food wastage.
Oh.
So based on the radius. So for example, I can go on the app. Marks and Spencer will have a bag. The bag may cost me £10, and I may be lucky enough to get a couple of fillet steaks in that bag, and I'll go and pick up at 8 o'clock this evening.
Oh, right. I'm going to check that out. That's really cool.
You've got children at university.
Yeah. Night at the disco or night at the restaurant?
Restaurant, then disco.
Okay. Favorite food?
Italian.
Favorite movie?
Lawless.
If you were to describe yourself in 2 words, what would they be and why?
Firm, fair.
Can you tell me a little bit about your proudest moment in your career to date?
Earning our first Selligent home.
Great. Favorite place that you've been on holiday or just visited in general in your life?
Got to say Mauritius.
Lovely. I get some funny answers to this one. So, if you have one, what's your guilty pleasure?
Oh, Haribo, all day long.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's good. PG version. Perfect. Look, Roy, great fun. Thank you so much. Look, we're going to get this out in the coming weeks, so hopefully people get some value from it. Let's obviously stay in touch as we always do. Appreciate you taking an hour of your time to share some of that with the listeners.
And likewise, Simon. Yeah, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Good stuff.